All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Sarah Omaligi. I am the Executive Director of the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, and I am so pleased to be here tonight with Nicole, Lily, and Ariel to talk about the latest science behind the impacts of dogs off leash in natural areas and visitor compliance, which is usually something that we're trying to strive for all the time, with not just with dogs off leash, but with all things. Before we get started tonight, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. So I am coming to you from Canmore, Alberta, and I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous groups whose traditional territories you occupy as well in the way you live, work, and play. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, I honor and acknowledge the Canmore area known as Chuwapchipchian-Kudi-B, translated in Stoney Nakoda as shooting at the willows, and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Yarhe Nakoda, comprised of the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy, composed of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai. I acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And I acknowledge all nations who live, work, and play and help us steward this land and honor and celebrate this territory. I'll just go over a couple housekeeping items before we launch in. So if you do have questions, I encourage you to put them into the chat. I will be moderating an open Q&A after each of our three speakers have spoken. And other than that, I think we are good to go. So our first speaker of the evening is Nicole Cajal from the Mistaki Institute here in Alberta. And she's going to talk to us about urban wildlife and dogs, how our park use may be impacting wildlife behavior. And I will just make you the spotlight, Nicole, and you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you about one of our wildlife monitoring programs, and this is called Calgary Captured. The Mistaki Institute, whom I work for, manages this project in partnership with the City of Calgary, Alberta Environment and Parks, the Friends of Fish Creek Provincial Park Society, and the Weaselhead Glenmore Park Preservation Society. So we have a really great group of government, local and provincial, and some community groups here in Calgary. And we are currently generously funded by Enbridge, the Calgary Foundation, and TD Friends of the Environment for this project. And I just want to explain what the Mistaki Institute does. We are a not-for-profit applied research institute affiliated with Mount Royal University in Calgary. And our goal is a world where communities have genuine access to the science and research they need to make choices that promote healthy landscapes. And we work in three priority areas of ecological connectivity, ecosystem climate adaptation, and biodiversity. And so this program, the Calgary Captured Wildlife Monitoring Program, was initiated in 2017 with several main objectives. And this was first and foremost, very simply to determine which medium and large species occur in Calgary and where. Prior to this program, there was no systematically collected information to give scientific data on what species were here. And then we also wanted to gain a better understanding of how wildlife are using the ecological network. In Calgary, the city has modeled its ecological network. It's really awesome. It's actually in our municipal development plan. And so we would like to use the cameras to monitor and validate that these modeled corridors are being used and how animals respond to the built environment, how animals are responding to development that's occurring directly adjacent to these corridors, because our city is ever growing and expanding. We also wanted to engage Calgarians in urban wildlife. First and foremost, spread awareness that urban biodiversity is here in Calgary, that it's a positive thing, and to spread awareness on how to peacefully coexist with urban wildlife, with the hopes that because we're going to need to invest in biodiversity, maintaining and restoring biodiversity in Calgary, we need to have Calgarians to support those investments. And then we plan to use this information to facilitate the consideration of biodiversity in management and planning. And so this is just a map of Calgary. We placed cameras using a 1 kilometer square grid system placed over parks that we chose to monitor. And we chose to monitor parks based on the largest parks in Calgary, as well as their contribution to the ecological network. We had over 90 cameras, 96 cameras located throughout Calgary. And just want to note on this map that I guess it's kind of faint. There's a gray ring around the city. That's our ring road. The southwest portion has been recently complete, the Sutina Trail, Stony Trail. And I'd just like to note that because that's one of the major barriers that wildlife have in our city. And that southwest portion has been particularly worrisome for our ecosystems, but particularly in the southwest along the Elbow and Bow River. And I'll mention later how we are using cameras to monitor the investments that were made to help facilitate wildlife movement under those roads later on. So we get lots of cool photos of wildlife. And I'm going to just go over some general results that we got from the program before I dive into our dog specific findings. We have results from the first 3 years of monitoring. So that's from May 2017 to May 2020. So not surprising, this is one of the biggest cities in Canada. 76% of our events captured on camera were of humans. So these are humans alone and humans with their dogs. It also includes photos. It also includes dogs. And the remaining 24% were of wildlife. Also unsurprising to Calgarians that deer was the vast majority of wildlife captured on camera, and coyote. And then 4% of the wildlife were other, including moose, red fox, bobcat, cougar, black bear, raccoon, weasel, and many different others. This project was, again, focusing on medium to large terrestrial mammals. And then we found that the parks that have the highest species diversity are Fish Creek Provincial Park, our largest and only provincial park in the southern area of the city. And Weaselhead Glenmore Parks, and then Griffith Woods, which are along the Elbow River. On this map, it's kind of in the center of the map. And then this map shows that the darker blue has the most wildlife activity that we found. And so while we found coyote and deer in every single park that we monitored, we did find that some of the more rare species for Calgary, like black bear, cougar, and moose, were primarily only found on closer to the borders of the city, so closest to the outskirts of the city. And so here's bear and cougar. Yeah, as you can see, they're primarily in the southwest on the outer edges of those parks that have connections to the outer edge of the city. And the ring road kind of cuts them off. So we're hoping that wildlife movement can continue to happen in those mitigation areas. And so we wanted to look at how wildlife responds to human use in our parks. And we did this in 3 different ways. We looked at how wildlife activity overlaps with human activity. And we did find that wildlife is more active at night in those parks that have more non-wildlife activity. So we define non-wildlife activity as humans and dog activity. So majority of those photos are humans alone, humans with their dogs, and dogs alone. So the dogs alone, we don't have a stray population that I know of in Calgary. So these are people who are visiting parks and their dogs are off leash. So this relationship was weak for some species like coyotes and mule deer, which isn't surprising because those species are known to thrive in urban areas and human-dominated systems. But some species, particularly carnivores like cougar and red fox, visit Calgary's parks almost entirely during nighttime hours. We rarely saw these animals during the day. And then we also wanted to look at how wildlife responded to short-term versus long-term patterns. And we actually found that you're looking at a single camera location. There was no short-term response of wildlife to a human or a dog visiting that camera. So if a human or dog passed by a camera, it didn't actually have an impact on if we would see a wildlife species within the short term at that camera location. but we did find that wildlife are shifting their long-term daily activity patterns to minimize the probability of encountering humans and dogs. And so this is just kind of talking about that a little bit more, but we also, as part of our project, we classified images based on if dogs were on leash or off leash. And so we found that carnivore species like cougar and fox, they're more likely to avoid human and dog activity, period, than other species. But we did found across all species, they had less overlap with just domestic dogs when off leash. So that's showing that wildlife are not using parks at the time that times when there's a lot of off-leash dog use in those parks. And so these are just some photos. We have certain areas that have a really high number of off-leash dogs. And here is a map of just off-leash dog events that we captured per day. So the blue, the light blue, and darker blue are the higher events of off-leash dogs per day at certain camera locations within that 1 kilometer grid. And the red hashed areas of this map are showing where in the city there are designated public off-leash areas. So the majority of our cameras are obviously outside of these areas. There's only a few natural environment parks in Calgary that have designated off-leash areas. And also to note, these are unfenced off-leash dog areas. And so we have 2 main recommendations that have to do with people's behavior with leashing their dogs. And they're pretty simple. So because we found that medium to large terrestrial mammals, especially carnivores, are sensitive to levels of human activity and off-leash dogs, that we think park closures should be supported. So park closures should be put in place if they're not already in certain parks, and they should be enforced to give wildlife the time that they need in those areas. And then we recommend that there is some education and enforcement of on-leash dog areas for dog owners in Calgary. We actually found that the proportion of dogs off-leash versus on-leash were the same, whether or not, so I'm just going to flip back to this map, whether or not they were inside those hashed areas that allow off-leash dogs or outside. So I think that wording might be a little bit confusing, but it basically shows that Calgarians' behaviors with regards to leashing their dogs actually isn't changing whether they're not inside of these designated off-leash dog areas. So we recommend that enforcement education is needed around those areas, but particularly for Nose Hill, Confluence, and Edworthy Parks, as well as the southern portion of Fish Creek Provincial Park, because we found in those areas where there were no off-leash dog designated areas, that's where the highest rate of off-leash dogs were. And those are all pretty important areas for our ecological network. And so now what we are continuing to monitoring, so that was just the first 3 years of data. We're continuing to monitor for at least another 3 years. We have scaled back the number of parks we are monitoring, but we're continuing to monitor some key natural environment areas and corridors, and continuing to work with the public to communicate biodiversity issues and work with the city to figure out how we can incorporate this information into their management and planning processes. Our next leg of the project that we're just getting into is that we are working with the city to validate the ecological network and expand that network. Right now it ends at, I have a map. So this is the map of the ecological network. It ends at Calgary's borders. So we would like to connect that network outside of the city. We know animals are coming in and out and through Calgary outside of the city, so that we can work on facilitating a coordinated regional effort to maintaining our ecological network, healthy wildlife populations, and a healthy ecosystem. And then I mentioned that we're validating some wildlife corridors to inform that next leg of the modeling. And we're looking at patterns in animal detection before and after development. We have a lot of parks that have development occurring right next to it or right in the middle of the corridors. And so we're looking at how that impacts the wildlife detection. Are wildlife still able to get through those areas of the city? And then finally, we're continuing to monitor some mitigation efforts. So these photos are from a bridge, a Stony Trail Bridge. And so we are monitoring our wildlife using these areas now that they're built, and they're built for wildlife movement. If they are, it highlights the value of those investments. And then we can also make some recommendations to make those better to inform future road and major development decisions. And that's it for my talk. Here's my information and website if you guys want to get in touch with me after.
That's great, Nicole. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm already starting to jot down ideas and thoughts. And of course, anybody who is here tonight, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'll ask them all at the end. But if it's hot in your mind right now, go ahead and throw it in the chat. I'll turn it over to our next speaker, Ariel Parsons from the Lincoln Park Zoo in Illinois. And she's going to talk to us about the ecological impact of dogs on wildlife in Eastern North America. Ariel, it is all you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Well, so it's great to be here. I'm so excited. This is already started off to be a very interesting webinar. So I'm going to talk today about some work that we did several years ago, but that I think is still really relevant to what we're talking about today. So, you know, kind of exploring those ecological impacts and seeing kind of what forms they might take and implications for that. So we are, of course, talking about dogs today, and we know that, you know, free-ranging dogs in different parts of the world can be, you know, really detrimental. There have been several studies, many studies at this point, looking at their effects on wildlife. And when we're talking about free-ranging dogs in kind of the developing world, they really act more as predators, perhaps, than a lot of the dogs, you know, in North America. And so they can be very detrimental to populations of sensitive species. They can cause indirect effects through stress that affect fitness. But in North America and other developing countries where we have fewer free-ranging dogs, it's really not quite as clear what the effects could be of our dogs on wildlife, because most of our dogs are owned. They tend to be leashed, although as we just heard, not always, and I've got some data to support that as well. But nevertheless, you know, they are under, for lack of a better word, some sort of control, as opposed to a feral dog that is more or less acting like a wild animal. And so, you know, although a lot of dogs visit our protected areas in North America every year, it's just really unclear, because they're with humans for the most part, under control, what their ecological impacts are. There have been some studies, although relatively few studies, kind of trying to look at this a little more and find out, you know, what the importance of dogs is for the ecosystem. And so this is one example of a study done way back in 2001 in Boulder, Colorado, looking at mule deer and how they responded to humans, you know, hiking through Colorado, the Boulder open space, and how that changed when they had a dog compared to when they didn't. And they found that mule deer did respond to humans behaviorally. They increased their vigilance and their flushing distance. So there were these measurable indirect effects, and that those increased when the humans had a dog. So, you know, that tells us that dogs are, even, you know, when they're with a human, when they're leashed, they are perceived by wildlife as a threat, which could manifest as these, again, indirect effects that could, you know, take energy, take away from foraging time, and ultimately impact fitness. But there's really a need to understand these dynamics at a larger scale, and kind of hopefully generalize across different areas and different species to see, you know, what if we can understand these impacts a little bit more. So that's what we set out to do in the mid-Atlantic United States, taking a citizen science approach. So we worked with hundreds of citizen scientists across 6 states in the mid-Atlantic, And this was a partnership between the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, North Carolina State University, and the Smithsonian Institution, with funding from the NSF and the US Forest Service. And we targeted protected areas throughout, again, the mid-Atlantic states. And one thing that we were interested in, which I'm not going to really talk about today, but it was kind of the impetus behind the study, was looking at the effects of consumptive and non-consumptive recreation. So mostly hunting or not hunting. So we had these paired protected areas, one that allowed hunting and one that didn't allow hunting. But then we stratified our sampling among areas that had different regulations for dogs. And so some of them prohibited dogs completely. Some of them allowed dogs, but only leashed dogs. And then others allowed dogs and didn't really care whether the dogs were leashed or not. And so we were able to kind of make some comparisons and at the very least kind of summarize the compliance within each of these protected areas based on the rules, which, as Nicole talked about, compliance is not always high. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the basic design of our study was to locate our camera traps along hiking trails, because we're interested in humans, and hopefully most humans with their dogs use hiking trails. But we're also interested in what happens off the trails. So we set these transects of cameras with one camera on the trail, one camera 50 meters from the trail, and then one camera 200 meters from the trail. So that way we could kind of track, especially when people had off-leash dogs. If we saw a human walking on the trail and then we saw a dog off the trail at roughly the same time, we could infer that that dog probably belonged to that human, although they were kind of running off the trail. And so these transects were chosen at random through all these protected areas. There were 33 protected areas in total, and in total about 2,000 camera traps throughout those 33 protected areas that ran for about a month each. So what we found is we got about over 150,000 pictures of humans, almost 25,000 pictures of dogs. The vast majority of dogs, 97%, were accompanied by humans, meaning that there was a human within 5 minutes of a dog detection. So again, they weren't necessarily on leash with that human, but they were very close by and not just kind of running off on their own. Of that 97% of dogs that were accompanied by humans, only 28% of them were leashed. And so, you know, not great. But 99% of them were on trails, and 99% of them were detected during the day. So we did not have a lot of nocturnal activity of the dogs, which is, you know, good news for wildlife. So having a leash law in a protected area decreased the frequency of off-trail dogs by 21%. I mean, we're still at, you know, 28%, you know, leashing overall, but we can bump that up a little bit when we have those leash laws in place. So that's somewhat encouraging. But prohibiting dogs completely from a protected area did not prevent dogs from being in that protected area. We detected dogs in all of the 33 protected areas, regardless of any dog prohibition. But having a law to prohibit dogs from that area did reduce the dog use of that area in terms of their kind of relative abundance by a factor of 10. So these, you know, laws and regulations did have effects, but they certainly were not 100% effective. So, you know, keeping that in mind, we have dogs off leash and on leash. We have dogs in places where dogs are prohibited. They're there. And so now we start thinking about, okay, what are the impacts potentially on the wildlife, on the, you know, ecology of the system in these protected areas? So those impacts take two forms. There are the direct impacts and the indirect impacts. The direct impacts are, you know, direct predation on wildlife species, which is not something that we were able to measure in this study, but it certainly could happen, especially when dogs are off leash. It's those indirect impacts that are a little bit less well understood. They can be kind of insidious in that, you know, they don't seem like they would be a big problem, but they could potentially add up. So they are kind of important to understand. And these are effects like heightened stress just from the mere presence of a dog or a human. Being chased obviously expends energy, it creates stress. It will potentially increase vigilance, which means less time is spent foraging. So it means that nutrition will potentially decline, and it could mean complete avoidance either of sites that are used by dogs, so they're using lower quality sites because the dogs are present in a higher quality site. And again, that can have implications for fitness over time. So these are the impacts that we're generally interested in measuring. We considered 4 different types of predators. Predators, I'll put in quotes. So we've got humans, then we've got humans with a dog, whether that dog is on leash or off leash. We didn't distinguish between the two in this study. We have a dog alone that is not attended by a human, and then we have coyotes, which is the only native predator in the system for any of these species. We considered 3 prey species which differed in their activity patterns. So crepuscular white-tailed deer, diurnal eastern gray squirrels, and nocturnal northern raccoons. And we measured 3 different types of indirect effects. First is vigilance, and we only measure that for white-tailed deer. So are white-tailed deer more nervous in areas where there are dogs? Spatial avoidance, can we detect any sort of avoidance of areas used by dogs for each of the prey species? And then temporal avoidance, so do prey increase the amount of time that they might leave a site? So do they temporarily leave a site that was recently used by a predator species only to return, after some safe amount of time has gone by? So can we detect kind of a lengthening of the amount of time of that return time in response to a predator passing by? So this is deer vigilance. So here we're looking on the y-axis at the percent of sequences. So essentially the percent of photographs taken where the deer was vigilant. And so vigilance behavior, we just measure as the head up versus head neutral or head down. And if the head is down, then they're foraging. And if the head is up, then they are being vigilant. They're looking around, they're nervous about something, or just making sure that they're safe. And that takes away from the foraging time. So that's why this is kind of an important measure in terms of response to predation or predation risk. So on the x-axis, we have the 4 different types of predators. Then the green bars are showing sites where that particular predator was present. And the blue bars are showing the sites where that particular predator was absent. And what we see is that we see no significant differences in the amount of vigilance exhibited by the deer, except at sites where there are humans, but without dogs. So at sites where we never detected any dogs, but we did detect humans, deer tend to be significantly more vigilant than at sites without humans, also without dogs. So we're seeing kind of some evidence that humans, at least in terms of for white-tailed deer, make them nervous, and that they're going to be more vigilant in those areas. And that makes sense. Of course, deer are the most hunted species that we sampled here. And so humans certainly represent a danger for them, and that they are no doubt perfectly aware of. The next thing we looked at was spatial avoidance. So again, this is whether or not we can detect an animal kind of shifting space and moving out of an area if that area is used by a predator species. So here we took an occupancy approach. So this is looking at the probability of essentially use of a site, taking into account the fact that we don't always have this ability to perfectly detect every species that we survey with camera traps. So on the y-axis is the conditional probability of occupancy, and it's conditional on the 4 different predator species shown on the x-axis. And this is an example with gray squirrel, but the darker gray bars are showing sites where the predator is present, the probability that a gray squirrel occupies sites where the predator is present, and then the white bars are the probability that a gray squirrel occupies a site where the predator is absent. And what we see here is those overlapping error bars. So we have no significant difference for eastern gray squirrel, and this was true for the other species as well. No significant signal of a spatial avoidance. So in other words, these prey species do not appear to be avoiding sites used by any of those predator species. So it's not kind of to the level where they are completely abandoning sites just because the predators are using them. So that's a good thing. It's good that they're still using those sites. But the next question is, are they maybe kind of temporarily avoiding these sites expending that energy to leave the site for a certain amount of time, some safe amount of time, and then returning to the site only later after maybe the scent of a predator has dissipated. And so we looked at this as the kind of time latency, so the amount of time between successive detections of each of our prey species, and whether that time lengthened if a predator, was in between these successive detections, as opposed to if a non-predator species was in between those successive detections. So was there a significantly longer amount of time? We call this the T2-T1 ratio, or the avoidance attraction ratio. So we've got, an initial detection of a white-tailed deer up to an initial detection of a predator. We call that T1. And then the time from the predator detection to the next deer detection is T2. And as that T2 gets longer and longer and longer, we can infer that that deer is taking a longer time to return to that site, and then see, if that relates to these predators at all. So here's the results with white-tailed deer. We've got that avoidance attraction ratio on the y-axis, the 4 predators again on the x-axis, and we can see just kind of the relative magnitudes of this kind of level of avoidance, if you will, or this magnitude of the T2-T1 ratio, that attended dogs have that higher magnitude, and so attended dogs meaning humans with their dogs, which would tend to indicate that these white-tailed deer are seeing those attended dogs as a greater risk. So they're abandoning those sites temporarily, but they're only coming back to them after a much longer period of time after the humans with their dogs have passed by. And that was true also for all 3 of these species, that those attended dogs had the very highest of those temporal kind of response ratios. So they seem to evoke the largest avoidance response, and larger even than the native predator of these species, which is the coyote. It's the only native predator for any of these species out on the landscape, and attended dogs definitely, relatively speaking, had a higher magnitude in terms of this temporal response. So this suggests that humans, especially those with dogs, may have a higher indirect effect, or the potential for higher indirect effects on wildlife, at least in terms of temporal patterns, than those native species do. And this is consistent with a lot of the small scale studies that have been done, such as in Colorado's Boulder open space. This is very consistent with those results. So what we can conclude from this work is that, as we all know, dogs are common in protected areas. But even though they're common, and humans are common as well, humans are perceived as a risk by wildlife. But having a dog with the human seems to compound that risk perception, and wildlife appear to, at least temporarily, be responding more strongly to humans that have dogs with them. But compared to reports that are published for dog disturbance from free-ranging dogs, so the disturbance of free-ranging dogs on wildlife tends to provoke, much kind of larger responses. It'll provoke spatial responses, for example, which we didn't detect in this study. So that seems to suggest that, the attended dogs that we have in North America in our protected areas are not having nearly the kind of level of indirect effects of free-ranging dogs elsewhere in the world. So that's good news. Other good news is that it seems like the current levels of dog management are benefiting the potential for ecological impact in terms of reducing the number of off-leash dogs, in terms of reducing the number of dogs overall where dogs are prohibited, but we can do better. And I think, similar to, what Nicole was talking about, always thinking about, okay, how can we improve compliance of leash laws and dog prohibitions, and try and, keep our dogs with their humans on a leash as much as possible. And that will, go a long way towards reducing the potential for indirect impacts on wildlife in our protected areas. And with that, yeah, that's all I have to share with you today, but this has been really fun to participate.
Thank you so much, Ariel. I have to say that some of your results were a little surprising for me, and And I'm really looking forward to talking about them in the Q&A. I see there is a whole bunch of questions coming into the chat, which is really, really great. And I'll turn it over to Lily for our last talk of the evening. We have Lily Van Eden from the Victoria State Government in Australia, and she's going to be talking a little bit about dog owner leashing behaviors in different kinds of natural areas. So we'll start to get into a little bit of this compliance kind of theme that keeps popping up, I think. Lily, take it away.
Okay, thank you. I hope you're seeing my screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Oh no, wait, sorry, I'm not. I'm looking at your lovely face. I'm not looking at your PowerPoint. There you go.
That's better? Okay.
Yes,
perfect.
now I'm looking at your title slide. Take it away.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Lily Van Eden, and I work in government in Victoria, Australia, but I'm also affiliated with a couple of research teams at RMIT and Monash universities. And one of those is a group called Behaviour Works, which are very behavioural psychology focused. So the work I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about understanding people's behaviours and thinking about how to change behaviours. And it's been great seeing some questions related to that pop up in the chat. Yeah, okay. So as I said, I'm based in Victoria, which is in the southeast of Australia. For those of you not familiar with Australian geography, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Wurundjeri country, and the Wurundjeri people would have managed this land for tens of thousands of years prior to European colonization. And that would have included managing interactions between dogs and humans and wildlife, but in a very different way. So there would have been Australia's native dog, the dingo, in this part of the world back then, but there is no longer due to conflicts with sheep production initially, and now it's very urbanized where I live, so there are no dingoes here anymore. But anyway, so as I said, I work in government, and I just want to give a bit of a background to why we were doing this work. So the government will always have in place some sort of biodiversity management plan, which previously, in previous years, the one we're working towards at the moment is lasts for about 20 years, a 20-year framework, and the previous ones would have been very ecologically focused in terms of the targets and means of improving outcomes, thinking about biodiversity. And so the most recent one that we're working under at the moment is the first one to have a really human-focused element to it. And so we've been doing some work thinking about the kinds of behaviours people could engage in or stop engaging in to protect the environment or prevent harming the environment. So there was a behavioural prioritisation process through expert elicitation, trying to come up with a short list of behaviours that the broad masses could engage in or cease engaging in to have meaningful impact on nature. And one of those is a group of behaviours which we're calling responsible pet ownership. And so today I'm talking about dog leashing, but we've also done some work on cat containment as well. So as part of the work that we've been doing, every year we run a statewide survey that's intended to be representative of the Victorian public. And that allows us to monitor how people are reporting to be engaging in our target behaviours over the years to see if that's changing over the 20-year period that this program's in place. But it also gives us an opportunity to add in a few questions to sort of dive into behaviours of interest each year. And so the data that I'm presenting today was from our 2020 survey, and that included just over 300 respondents who own dogs. And as a side note, I don't know what this means for our data, but Melbourne, Victoria has been one of the most COVID lockdown cities in the world. So a lot of people would have been stuck at home during this time, just as something to think about with our data. But basically, thinking about why we did this, there's already been quite a bit of research done. I think this is true globally, but also in Australia, research done on leashing behaviours, mostly around coastal areas. This Australian data is very biased towards coastal areas and very location-based. So it might be a study where people in the community are surveyed about a particular beach, or there's a monitoring study where people are observed to see if they're complying with leashing behaviours in a particular area. But we didn't know how much the findings from those studies translated to different kinds of natural areas. So we thought, we've got this opportunity to do a statewide survey. Let's ask people about the broad range of different places that they take their dogs and what their behaviours are in terms of leashing in those places. And so we asked people about urban parks and sports grounds. We asked people about water-based areas, so beaches, rivers, and wetlands. And we asked people about terrestrial nature areas, so nature reserves, hiking trails, things like that. And for the first two categories, we asked people about urban parks that do have leashing requirements and ones that allow dogs to be off leash. We didn't do that for the nature reserves, hiking trails category, just because you'd be hard pressed to find a place in Victoria where you're allowed to let your dog off leash in a nature reserve. I think maybe that's something a little bit different from the North American context. And then we asked people, how often do you allow your dogs off leash in this area? And we were really interested in understanding who fits into this never category for the places that you are expected to leash. Who are the people who always comply? And as Nicole and Ariel have said, similarly, compliance was low. And I actually thought it was lower than we were expected, given that this is self-reported data. It's not observational. You'd expect people, when they're asked about their behavior, to paint a better picture of themselves with complying with the rules. But so it's possible that the compliance is even lower than what was said to us. But we found that compliance was reported to be highest in urban areas where you are expected to leash, and that was still just under 50%. And so we found places, we found other places that it varied, but there did appear to be some relationship between having leashing rules in place and not having leashing rules in place, but nonetheless, compliance was not that high. And so as I've been saying, we wanted to draw on some behavioural insights to try and understand what's shaping people's behaviour in natural areas. And so we included in the survey a range of different questions relating to different factors that might have influenced whether someone was likely to comply with leashing rules or not. And so I won't go into the details of those, but just overall, there were some things in there about social norms. So to what extent do people feel that they are expected to leash their dog in natural areas? How to what extent do people feel they have control over their dog when it's off leash? Will it return to them when called? How much might it be a nuisance to other park visitors or a nuisance to wildlife? Beliefs about the benefits of off-leash roaming. Do people think that off-leash roaming was necessary for their animals' health and for them to benefit from being in that place? Perceptions that there aren't enough places for people to take their dogs to where they're allowed off-leash. Questions around people's perceptions of should dogs be allowed to go places where there are threatened wildlife, support for the existence of leashing rules in the first place, some demographic variables like age, gender, level of education, a range of different things. And then we also looked at habits. So you could think about that as, did the existence of leashing laws have a strong impact on whether people leashed or not? And also, are people leashing in places where they're expected to just out of habit because they always leash their dogs, whether they're expected to leash them or not? And so we, first of all, I'll just mention a couple of the results here. I'm not presenting the results of every question that we asked, just in the interest of brevity, but I've copied a few here where there was some consensus. So we found that generally social norms conducive to leashing were really strong. Not everyone's doing it, but most people expected that you should be. About 70% of people would say that I feel obliged to keep my dog on leash in a natural area, and other people would expect me to. And we also found there was generally high support for having leashing regulations, and also that people had wildlife in mind when thinking about this. So people were supportive of not allowing dogs in places where there are threatened wildlife. So we ran 3 different regression models to look at the significant predictors, and I'm just going to highlight here what some of the significant predictors were in each of these regression models. So for each of these are places where you were expected to leash your dog. So we're asking people, think about the places where you take your dogs, how often, and we're asking you about places where there are leashing rules, how often do you allow your dog off leash in those places? And for all of the places that we ran these regressions for, social norms were important. So people who held these strong social norms about leashing were more likely to leash. So social norms are important. The other thing in urban areas was habit. So people who leash their dogs in areas that don't require leashing are more likely to do so in areas where you are expected to leash. I'll talk about that a bit later. In terms of places that are water-based, so beaches, rivers, wetlands, we found that older people are more likely to comply with the rules. Again, social norms are important. We found that people who held concerns about impacts to wildlife were more likely to comply. And again, there seemed to be a relationship with habit driving people's behaviours. They just always leash their dogs, so they're more likely to comply. It's not the presence of leashing that is encouraging people to leash. And the final category we ran this test for was other natural areas like bushland and hiking trails. We found that in these contexts, women were more likely to comply with the rules. Again, social norms were important. And also people who didn't leash were more likely to believe that there were benefits to their dog in not leashing. So things like, my dog doesn't get enough exercise on leash. It's safer to let my dog off leash in natural areas than compared with their urban areas where there might be more dogs and more traffic. And they felt that there were health benefits of allowing their dog off leash. So we tried to draw some overall behavioural insights from this study, and also think a little bit about the different places where you might want to apply a different lens to trying to influence behaviour. So we thought about messaging, we thought about other behavioural interventions, and I'll summarise some of those things here. With regards to habit, so I talked about how, is it the presence of leashing, or is it just somebody's in the habit of keeping their dog on a leash? So it doesn't matter whether there's a leashing rule or not. Habits are really hard to change from a behaviour science perspective. And so in this instance, we might think more about, if we're going to find it really hard to change the behaviour of people who are already visiting these places and already have established habits of letting their dog off leash in those places, then maybe it's better to start targeting people who haven't yet created those behaviours. So thinking about new dog owners, could you work with local vets or local councils where dogs might be expected to be registered? And so when someone gets a new dog, they have provided with information to say, here are some great places you can take your dog off leash, and discourage people from going to places where you don't want dogs off leash. And the same for new residents in an area. When somebody's moved house, maybe you could work with real estate agents or other organisations that would have information about people coming and going from an area and provide them with similar information. Again, I found, as I said, social norms were important across the board. So rather than telling people less than half of visitors to this park leash their dogs, it's better to promote relevant messaging that will support the desired behaviour. So in this case, as I was saying, we found that in general, around 70% of people feel that there is an expectation that you should leash. And so leveraging that in the messaging on signage or however you're delivering your communication could help to encourage people to increase leashing. And also, I mentioned a couple of demographic variables that were appropriate at different places. So at beaches, it was older people more likely to comply, and in other terrestrial natural areas, women were more likely to comply. So in those places, it might be young people and men that you're targeting. So maybe the pictures used in the signage or in other forms of communication could present images of the people who you're trying to target doing the right thing, saying, hey, look, young men are the people like you are likely to leash, so you should act like people who are like you. And then we thought about some of the differences between these different areas. So in urban parks, emphasizing that actually there can be just as much risk to your dog in urban areas as there can be in urban parks as there might be in natural areas. So there might be risks with interacting with other dogs and vehicles and things like that, and potentially safety risks in natural areas. I'm sure the contexts are very different between where I am in Australia and where you are in North America. We don't have large terrestrial predators. Might come across a snake, but that's a seasonal thing. What else was I going to say? Oh yeah, and in beach type places, beaches and other water type places, emphasizing the risks to threaten wildlife seem to be important in shaping people's behaviors. And then the final thing to say, and I think this maybe accords a little bit with what Nicole and Ariel have said as well, is that we didn't find that the presence of leashing rules was the sole driver of people's behavior. It did seem there were differences in whether people leashed in areas with leashing regulations and those that don't have regulations. But it seems from the literature on this type of work that having stronger regulations can help to improve compliance with the target behavior. And I feel like this is a hard thing to explain, but basically if what you're trying to achieve is getting less people to have their dogs off leash, it might be that setting the standard higher, setting the goalposts further away, might get more people further along the spectrum in terms of reaching that behavior. So for example, we have lots of beaches where I live in Australia that might say something like, your dog's allowed to be here, but only between certain hours of the day, or it's only allowed to be here certain months of the year, or it's allowed to be here, but it's allowed to be off leash at sometimes, and sometimes it's not. And it becomes confusing, but also it's hard for people to draw distinctions and change their habits to comply with those rules. So sometimes it's better to just have stronger rules and say, don't bring your dog here at all. And of course, some people are still going to do it, but less probably. That sounds like I'm ending on a negative note. So just to summarize some of the things I've been saying, leveraging social norms is really important, encouraging people to think about what others expect them to do and how their dog being off leash might impact other people with dogs and wildlife. Talking about the benefits of dogs roaming off leash and how these different kinds of natural areas, people can still receive the benefits of visiting natural areas, but keeping their dogs off leash, or taking their dogs keeping their dogs on leash, or taking their dogs to other kinds of areas where their dogs receive benefits that don't necessarily have those issues with interacting with wildlife. Considering target audiences in your messaging, and recognizing that habits are hard to break, and maybe that you need to just consider a certain subset of the population when you're trying to promote good behaviors. I've got the reference here to the study that I've been talking about, and I can copy the link to that in the chat. It's not open access, but if anybody wants to read that paper, please do feel free to send me an email. So thank you.
That's great, Lily. Thank you so much. Just move the spotlight. And there are a lot of questions in the chat. For reality, we are not going to be able to get to all of your questions. So if one of your questions is burning and you just cannot possibly handle not knowing the answer, you're more than welcome to email me or one of the presenters tonight, obviously. You can email me at info@actws.ca. and I'll forward your email to the appropriate speaker. I'll also just say before we go into the Q&A that all of our webinars are free, but we love donations. We're a nonprofit organization, and we create these hot topic webinars to help bring science into the public conversation about, dogs off leash or other things that are important to us. And so there is also a link to donate on our website, and I will throw that in the chat. And I'm just going to start with, I know a few of us definitely have questions about how effective fines or enforcement measures are in changing off-leash behaviors in areas that require it. And I'll actually just throw that out to all three of you to see, what do you think is more effective, the carrot or the stick? Nicole, let's start with you because you spoke first.
Sure. So I don't actually have experience on how effective the enforcement actually is, but from my perspective, if we know that these areas for wildlife are constricted, we know these corridors are constricted, and that ecological connectivity is not just important to maintain wildlife populations, but it's important for us too, which is a whole other conversation and really confusing to educate and get people to understand. My perspective is it really too much to ask to leash your dogs or bring them to designated off-leash areas? I don't think that's too much when you're looking at ecosystem sustainability and sustaining wildlife populations. I know in Calgary, they will at times fine for having your dogs off-leash, but it's very spotty for when they're enforcing it, and I'm not privy to why they might go to certain areas. It might be that there have been some conflicts in certain areas, so they show up.
Right. Ariel, what do you think about the carrot versus the stick?
Boy, yeah, that's a great question. That I don't know the answer to. My impression just from our work and from sort of things, Nicole and Lily, showed us as well, is that, the regulations help to a certain extent, and therefore it would follow that if you can back that up with some sort of enforcement, that you would get even better compliance and better compliance. I mean, I don't know that we'll ever reach 100% compliance. I mean, on any any, humans are humans, and dogs are dogs. But I guess I do favor the stick a little bit more, but at the same time, I think having options for, someone put in the chat, this question about, well, what about dogs for their own well-being that, need to be off leash? And, owning 2 dogs, in their younger days, I can totally sympathize with that. But I do think if there are designated areas where we know that the impacts will be lower, that's a kind of a good compromise.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Lily, what do you think about the carrot versus the stick? And your study is really around compliance. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to say doesn't draw directly from my study, but more my reading of the literature and understanding about this kind of stuff. I guess I don't see it as an either or, carrot or the stick. I would say, as I showed in my study, social norms are important. So you could use the stick, but I think, as others have commented in the chat, and I know is a problem where I am as well, is that it's all well and good to say that there are fines, but if there's no funding to support people going and enforcing those, then people might see that it's a rubber stamp kind of thing. But maybe that can be enforced somewhat by social norms and by people the community taking ownership over that place. So say you've got a particular natural area, and you can encourage social norms among the community that visits that natural area, that people might enforce it upon their neighbors. Nobody really you don't want to receive a fine, but you also don't want a member of your community saying, hey, put your dog on the leash. Like the community can support that through their behaviors. But also that doesn't just have to be your everyday park visitor. Maybe community ownership over an area and encouraging the community to enforce those expectations might be that there's, I don't know if you use this same terminology in North America, but we call it a friends of group, where you get a community of volunteers who are helping to manage that area, and having them be more engaged and feel ownership over that area. They might help with enforcement, even though it's not really enforcement, it's just projecting social norms and encouraging the right behaviors.
Yeah, I think I really like that you kind of really dove into social norms a little bit in your work, because I think it kind of speaks to another question that we have is how do you deal with this attitude of this is my city, I pay my taxes, and I want my dog to be off leash, so I'm going to let him be off leash. The coyotes are the problem, or the raccoons, or whatever. And that social norm is that I pay taxes, so I should be able to do whatever I want on public urban parks or whatever. But I'm just wondering how, do we just not try to change that social norm and focus on the people that are more concerned about wildlife? And Lily, you kind of talked about that at the end too, focusing on the positive messaging and the positive role models in the community. Do you think that's the answer? Do we just say, okay, buddy, with your, it's your city? But I don't know, thoughts?
I would say that particular mindset can be really hard to change, especially if the messaging is coming from government. If you're the kind of person who says, I pay my taxes, I'll do what I want, it's a bit of an anti-government sentiment. Yeah. So if government's trying to encourage these behaviors, then that's probably not the right messenger. Whereas that person might hold strong community values and care about what their neighbors and the other people they interact with think about them. So maybe they would respond better to somebody else within the community. And so I would say in those sorts of cases, targeting the people who are more easily converted could be effective at getting those stragglers in the behavior change over the line as well, possibly.
Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. Ariel, there's a question here about why raccoons were considered predators or prey in your study and not predators, because they're omnivorous. So how did you decide how to classify them?
Yeah, so we just classified them as a prey species because they are vulnerable to predation by dogs and even by coyotes. They are, they are big. Well, they're not that big, but they are scrappy little guys, as no doubt everyone is aware. But nevertheless, they can be preyed upon by dogs. And so dogs do, most dogs, I should say, maybe not most dogs, but larger dogs. Obviously, a smaller dog is going to be potentially in danger from a raccoon itself. But so we're kind of making this assumption that there's enough, when we're walking dogs out in a protected area, a lot of those dogs are kind of bigger medium to larger size dogs, and maybe not a whole lot of Chihuahuas walking out there. But that certainly is an assumption that we made.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks for explaining that. Nicole, there's a question in here about this idea of the park closures, like parks being closed overnight to create this human-free window, I guess, when animals who are more nocturnal can have human-free access to these parks. And I love this idea because this is something I've been exploring a lot in my work with bears, is like, can we control human use temporally so that we create these human-free windows of time where more wary animals can have access to these habitats? And I'm just wondering if you think in the city of Calgary, are you talking about parks that are already closed at night, or should more parks be closed at night? Would that be like a seasonal kind of management action, or like, how are you imagining that could be implemented?
Yeah, a lot of our parks in Calgary do have nighttime closures,
Right.
Primarily for human safety. And I do think that would be hard to enforce, whether enforcement is, fines or just presence or more education. But yeah, that's what I meant by recommending park closures, to maintain and enforce and educate around the parks that are already closed at night. And if there aren't any, designated nighttime park closures, to put that in place, because we see in Calgary that wildlife are using those parks primarily at night. So,
Yeah.
And it's fairly easy to control. There's not that many people in Calgary accessing parks in the middle of the night. There are some, but not a lot. So that just seems like a low-hanging fruit to help the situation.
Yeah, that's yeah. I love it. I love the idea of it. It is 7:34, or I think 10:34 in the morning for Lily. So we have gone 5 minutes over, and Ariel also is like at least 2 hours ahead, I think. Is it 9:30 for you, Ariel?
No, it's only 8:30.
8:30. Okay. Still, that's a long work day for all of us, and Lily's at the beginning of her work day. So I know there are so many other questions in the chat, and I will have a look at the chat and try to respond or forward your questions to speakers. I apologize we couldn't get to everything. I do want to thank Nicole, Ariel, and Lily for joining us this evening to share their work about dogs off leash. And I will just say that this is a field of research that needs more work. So if you know grad students, or you're looking for a graduate study, this could be your niche. It was actually very difficult for me to find any current research about dogs off leash in natural areas and impacts to wildlife. The Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society is an organization that values science and using science to inform wildlife and habitat management. And obviously how we manage dogs off leash in these areas can be pretty important for wildlife and important for the people who recreate there as well. So thank you all very much to our speakers. Thank you all so much for attending. And I'm going to stop the recording now.